righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, again, Jesus obviously isn't saying that law isn't important to him. That law isn't important to God, that these commandments aren't important to God. It's that he calls to a deeper level or a higher level, a righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. Other thoughts on that as it relates to the initial shocking value of it? Or what is this kind of righteousness that Jesus is talking about? And we have the benefit, if you were hearing this for the first time, I think it'd be really, really shocking. You know, we've heard this before. We know Jesus is teaching. We even know where he's going next in the Sermon on the Mount. So how does our righteousness surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees? David?
Because of Christ. And he will do it, has done for us. We realize that miserable sin is lost without him. At the same time, we learn so much of what he did for us. We want to do the best to obey. And we realize we will show.
Yeah.
As years go by, I'm not nearly as motivated as I was when I obeyed the gospel.
Okay.
I wanted to stick by it more than I just love everything that is.
Yeah, and I appreciate that observation. I think that's probably true of all of us, that our initial response oftentimes to the gospel, there's fear involved in that. I think there should be some fear involved in that. We don't want to go to hell. We're fearful of judgment, and so oftentimes our initial response of being baptized, becoming a Christian, trying to keep some of the commandments, trying to keep all the commandments, but is motivated by, I don't want to go to hell, I want to go to heaven. And David said as the years have gone by, he's less motivated by that, more motivated just by love. Wanting to be more what God wants me to be, wanting to be more like God. That becomes a motivating factor. Bryce?
So, I think it's a little bit what David was saying, but also a little bit different. I think of when Peter is asking my contract to my brother, 7
Yeah.
or 7,
Yeah.
and he tells him the concept, obviously meaning like not to limit it. So I kind of think of something like righteousness without limits, in the sense of it's not outward, you're not doing it because you have to, right? Like, oh, well, I have to give 3 over 7 times, so, you're not doing it because you have to, but doing it from your heart. So it's inward righteousness, not inward righteousness, not outward righteousness, and that will make it so it's not limited, right? Because you're doing it from your heart, you're doing it because you actually care, because you love them, like David said, you're not doing it because you have to, you're doing it because you want to.
Okay, great point. And again, I think when we sometimes talk about things like the kind of righteousness that Jesus describes in the Sermon on the Mount and throughout his ministry, again, sometimes it's talked about as a deeper righteousness, a righteousness from the inside out. Again, a righteousness without hypocrisy. He goes on later in the Sermon on the Mount to talk some more about hypocrisy that's in there. But, it's not just trying to keep commandments. It's understanding what the purpose and the motivation of the commandments was to begin with. And when we talk about things like the Sabbath, and Jesus trying to teach them about the Sabbath, they didn't really understand what the Sabbath was all about. They have all kinds of rules and regulations about the Sabbath, trying not to break the Sabbath, but they didn't understand the real purpose of the Sabbath. And I think we sometimes can come back and look at the Jewish nation and even comment on, they didn't really understand the purpose of the covenant with God. They didn't understand what God desired from them. God didn't just want commandment keeping. He wanted a people who would really love him with all of their heart. He wanted a people that would have a relationship with him. He wanted a people that would desire this because they love God, not just because we've got to keep these commandments because that's our tradition, that's our custom, or that's how we'll get things from God, or that's how we'll keep from being, thrown out of the land. Again, this fear of punishment that sometimes went with it. Trenton?
Yeah, and Matthew 23 is, the whole chapter is kind of Jesus pointing out that the Pharisees misunderstand what God's will is. He called them whitewashed tombs. Okay. He says they love greetings in the marketplace and be called rabbis. So they're not all of them, of course. So we're overgeneralizing. There are some Pharisees that are certain, right. But a lot of them seem to be more interested in the power and authority and the praise from their righteousness was only skin deep. It didn't go to their heart. It was external. That's what it did.
Absolutely. Great point. David?
you know, I mean, this is probably off topic of how I used to do, but, I was just thinking back when I was working, we had a building, we done sometimes a lot of walkthrough, it was a punch list, they call it. I was always more comfortable with the architect than the people, I think, if they knew what was going on. What was really heartbreaking and very stressful was when the owners would say, well, we're gonna have this person who had no knowledge of construction whatsoever. I think that's what you got here, is people, and he's trying, you know, he's trying to bring people up to speed. It's horrific. With somebody that does know what they're doing, trying to tell you what's right and what's wrong.
And even sometimes, though, I get your point, and you're right, but even among the religious leaders, they didn't get it. I mean, they're the ones that were supposed to, and that's why he uses the scribes and the Pharisees as an example. I mean, who they viewed as the experts in the law were the scribes, but the scribes had really gone a totally different direction with this than what God intended. And you can bring that home to today, different things that happen in the religious world, things that could happen to us. Again, I think all these warnings from Jesus, we need to take them. It's really easy and maybe in a twisted way fun to see the applications to other groups of people. You know, well, here's like what the denominations do here, and here's like what they do there, and misunderstanding God's law and commandments and not applying it here. But, you know, there's a real danger that we need to be careful, that I personally don't fall into this trap of viewing just external service to God, you know, skin deep, not really seeing the purpose behind it. Bryce?
I try not to be too far ahead, but I want to say something about, because I think it relates to this question, I think it relates to the rest of the material of what Jesus is talking about.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the Sermon on the Mount and just in his ministry in general, Jesus talks a lot about the old law, the old covenant, and like he just was right here, right, where he's talking about, I'm not come to abolish but to fulfill. Now, I think he's trying to show that there are principles behind the old law, the old covenant, because obviously the Pharisees are so focused on the actual specific laws that they lose the principle behind it. And so that's where Jesus starts to say, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, he's showing you're not getting it, right? And so he's showing that there's principles behind God's law, and that it's not just about the specific laws themselves, it's about your heart. And he says the greatest command too, right? They ask him the greatest command, he says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. They might look at that and say, well, that's about the vaguest law you have, right? I mean, that's pretty vague. It's not specific at all, but it's not vague, it's the principles. And those are the two greatest principles in the law. So I think that's what Jesus is really trying to show throughout the Sermon on the Mount and his whole ministry. I just wanted to say that, and that will help us think about it too as we go through
Yeah.
this.
And I do think there's some ways in which that is the transition. You know, this comment on your righteousness surpassing that of scribes and the Pharisees, and this connection with the law that he just said before it, do not think that I came to abolish the law. It's not about abolishing, it's about fulfilling it. And then you go rolling into this next section where he goes through all of these areas. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you, and he quotes from different commandments or interpretations of the commandments, an understanding of the law. When he's getting at the real point behind it, you need to understand what this is about. And it does seem to so often reflect on the heart. You know, the whole person, that's what this purpose was behind these different areas. Chuck?
I was going to say, the whole sermon started with the Beatitudes.
Yeah.
And I don't know that if you look at the Pharisees, you look at the Beatitudes, a lot of those like being moved to poor in spirit, things of that nature. That wasn't the Pharisees at all. You know, that's not how they came across to the people at all. So I think that from the very start, somebody said through it, they're like, okay, these are not what our leaders look like today.
Right, right. That's a great point. And again, I think some of these, when he gets into these specifics, and when you pick up in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 21, and going down through verse 48, again, I've got them listed here as 6 items: murder, adultery, divorce, vows, you know, this idea of retribution or justice or revenge, or however you want to look at it, an eye for an eye, and then loving your neighbor. And that Jesus is going to take a very different approach than what their religious leaders did. In all of these, their religious leaders would get very technical in how you can or cannot break these commandments. What do you have to do specifically? When are you violating the commandment? When are you not? Just like they did with the Sabbath. You know, you can go so many steps, but not a step beyond that. You know, you can lift a weight that lifts, you know, this much, but not anything beyond. And so they're trying to find ways to, you know, stay within bounds, but they're really kind of making it technical. Jesus goes much more to what is the purpose behind all these things? And that's a great point. It is in contrast. So this first section, which is a little bit longer, beginning in verse 21, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not murder, and whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court. By the way, is that true? You're not supposed to murder, and anybody who murders will answer to the court? Yeah, I mean, that's part of the law. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be answerable to the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar, and go first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Come to good terms with your accuser quickly while you are with him on the way to court, so that your accuser will not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will not be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last quadrants. I've got a different translation here. Now that last thing, you know, you're going to pay the last amount there. Again, the latter section of that kind of goes in another direction as it relates to this. But as you start with the murder, you're not supposed to murder. And if you murder someone, you're going to be guilty enough. You're coming to the court, and you know that's likely going to cost you your life. Where does Jesus go with this? David?
Well, I just think this, your murder is doing great damage that you can never. And when it talks about the tongue is a double-edged sword, that's, you know, that it proceedeth out of the mouth. So when you said there, you can take that, and then you say, and you're doing great damage to that person. You're hurting them to the deepest core of their being, especially when you're young. But I just, you know, I just, social media, for example, you know, and because when people that don't have the tax rate, you know, they share one side, you know, always two sides of the story. It certainly makes sense to me that you're committing a major sin when you start, even in your heart, because what if you see it out of heart, you end up, most of them, you end up acting on it eventually.
Okay. So Jesus takes this, not only is it true that if you murder someone, you'll answer the court, when he says if you're angry with your brother, you're answerable to the court.
Kind of murdering a part of their whole psyche, if they've been willing to.
Yeah. When he goes on and says, if you say, you know, you good for nothing, you're answerable to the Supreme Court. Whoever says you fool shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. I mean, his point here, the point behind not murdering someone isn't just not technically murdering them. The point is to have respect for people who are made by God in the image of God. You know, to truly love your neighbor as yourself, to have this. But when we start, you know, looking down on people in that way, it starts out when we're angry. We don't, you know, most of the time we're not to have anger. I mean, we're to put anger away from us. We're to put anger aside. God's going to take care of things. God's the one who can be righteous in his anger and his indignation. And so there are things. Now again, we may talk about righteous indignation. And there are times when we get angry because of things that are done, but we're not supposed to carry that anger towards someone. We're not supposed to be angry with a person. Maybe I'd say it's more being angry with situations, being angry with choices, being angry. You know, there are things that are done that aren't right, and I think that's okay that sometimes we get angry about it. But don't carry that over and then think this person is worthless. This person is a good for nothing. This person is a fool because of what they've done or how they think or act. David.
Where the scripture is, I think it says, be angry and sin not. Which is hard to do. You're trying to tell us how to do it.
Right. Be angry and sin not, let not the sun go down on your wrath. Where is that? Who's got a good concordance? It is. Anybody? I will have a hard time finding it since I switched Bibles because most of the
Ephesians
time.
4:26.
Ephesians 4. I was there, kind of Ephesians 1. Most of the time I look at the certain spot on the page that I've memorized over the years, and so when I change Bibles, it takes a while. Yeah, Ephesians chapter 4, and even if you begin in verse 25, therefore ridding yourselves of falsehood, speak truth to one another, truth each one of you with his neighbor, because we are parts of one another. Be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. And so there, you know, if you get angry, don't sin in that anger. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Don't give the devil an opportunity. I mean, what is that saying? How's that fit into this? What do you think?
Check. I don't know.
Yeah.
You can be angry though.
Don't let the sun go down on your anger.
And not sin, yeah. Just can't hold grudge either.
I think that's part of what that's saying is when we get angry, what do we do with that anger? How do we work through it? How do we resolve it? How do we, talk to a person about it if we have some anger? And again, if that anger is aroused because of something that's happened, can we approach somebody and say, when you did this, it really made me angry. And, let's try to address the issue there. Maybe I didn't have a right to be angry. Maybe I did have a right to be angry. Well, let's get that out. Let's resolve it so that we can move on. And what I think of you as a person doesn't change. I still love you, respect you, I accept you. We had a situation that caused anger, but we resolved that. And then the anger is put away, and by the time you're going to bed that night, there's no more anger. If you carry that anger, that gives the devil the opportunity. He's going to plant bad thoughts about that person. Then it becomes, I'm not angry because of what happened. It's, I don't like him or her. I'm angry at him or her, and that's part of what builds on it. David, did you have a comment? He did. He was angry at the situation. He took action. Yep.
Yeah, so I guess what I think is that he's actually angry at the action.
I think at least part of it.
Yeah.
Yep. Whether there's deeper than that, I do think it's significant, Matthew 5, when we were looking at this, whoever is angry with his brother. Not, again, angry at a situation, angry with someone's actions. I'm angry with my brother. And then what it leads to is follow-ups. Then I start thinking he's a good for nothing. And then I start thinking he's a fool. And then, I just don't like him. I have a problem with him instead of a problem with something that he's done or some action that took place. And when you've done that, when you can look at another person and they're good for nothing, they're worthless, they're a fool, you've pretty well murdered them in your heart, haven't you? They don't have, you're not going to listen to them, you don't respect them, you're not going to care about them, you're just going to write them off. And Jesus says that's part of what we need to be careful of when he takes that to the deeper level. So it's not just not murdering people. It's not being angry with them, thinking they're worthless, thinking they're good for nothing, thinking they're fools. And again, that's sometimes hard to do. And in our culture, I think especially, our culture is so divided politically, so divided religiously, so divided in other areas. How does one side typically treat the other side? They're morons, idiots, worthless. They're not even worth your time. These people that we have to put up with on the other side of whatever it is. Well, followers of Jesus can't be like that. May disagree with policies, politics, actions. Some things may be done, and that action makes you angry, but you can't treat people that way. And Jesus has that in there. Now, again, there's that little bit extra in there where he talks about, making peace and working things out. But again, even there, when he says, if you're coming to make your offering and you realize somebody has something against you, and I think what's implied here is you know what that is, and you know how to fix it. You need to go and fix that problem, and then come back to offer your offering to God. We can't pretend that we're on a right relationship with God when we know we're not in a right relationship with our brothers, and there's something we can do about it. So if somebody is upset with you and you know it, and you know there's a problem, try and get that problem fixed. That's also, I think, interesting the way that Jesus presents that, because it's not presented in this instance as you have a problem with someone else. It's you remember that your brother has something against you, that you go and you initiate that, which also might run counter-cultural, maybe counterintuitive. What do we sometimes say? Well, if he's the one with the problem, it's his responsibility to come and talk to me, right? If he has a problem with me, I don't need to do anything about it. He's the one with the problem. So he needs to come. That's not what Jesus said. If I know you have a problem with me, I need to go to you and try to get it resolved. So this is a deeper level of righteousness. this righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. Other comments on that or questions? He starts with a really hard one, in my opinion, to look at people and never have those kinds of thoughts concerning them. Go ahead, David.
Sometimes talking to this person, you may not even be aware of the situation yet. You may not be thinking you thought they were.
Sure.
But there are also times where you might approach somebody and feel like your attitude is right, just no, I'm not even speaking to you, I'm not going to talk to you.
Okay.
That's when it's harder to reach and feel the heart was right, a little more difficult because you may have so mad you're angry.
Right.
So we're not speaking there, I'm not going to talk to you ever again, and that's not why it's good.
No, we can't have that.
We gotta work pretty hard to get somebody so bad they don't want to speak.
You do, or you got to ignore it so long. Yeah, and again, I think that's where this don't give the devil an opportunity, and part of what Jesus is addressing is we let things fester for so long where the person just gets so frustrated with it. I do appreciate, I've occasionally had someone come to me and say, are you angry with me? And I wasn't angry with them or upset with them. And I appreciate that we were able to kind of get that, well, no, what did I do that made you think? And I'm sorry if I misrepresented something or said something in a bad way, or maybe I was angry at a situation, but I thought we resolved that. There's, we're good. And to have that practice of going to someone and just saying, I just want to make sure we're all good. We don't have anything. Now, it falls on us to be honest in those situations. If we do have a problem, we need to say it. Yeah, I am struggling a little bit right now. Okay, well, how can we fix that? What can we do to make that right? But Jesus starts with that one right off the bat. That it's not just murdering someone. Of course, that's the easy, he's kind of picking, he starts with what we might consider some of the biggest sins. What are the big ones? Well, killing somebody, I've never done that, never been guilty of that. Well, thinking somebody's good for nothing, thinking somebody's worthless or a fool, that might get a little bit closer to home with me. The second one, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. That's in verse 27. And again, that's one of those big ones that we oftentimes talk about, that thankfully most of us, I think, are able to say, hey, I've never killed anybody, I've never committed adultery, I've not done those big things. But, he says, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, if your right eye is causing you to sin, tear it out, throw it away from you, for it's better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand is causing you to sin, cut it off and throw it away from you, for it's better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Okay, so he comes back to the adultery one. It says, you've heard, don't commit adultery. Where did they hear that? Well, they heard it in the law. You shall not commit adultery. It's one of the commandments. But Jesus goes further. It says, if you're lusting after somebody, if you want to be with somebody else, and the only reason you're not doing it is because there's a law that says you're not allowed to do this action, he says in your heart you've already committed this. Now, I still think we need to be careful how we apply this. Is Jesus giving another technicality to the law? I've heard some trying to use it that way. And now coming back, somebody looks at pornography, they're guilty of adultery, divorce them, get rid of it. I don't think he's trying to equate this on giving you another legal reason for divorce or giving you another legal. He's saying, what's the point here behind some of these laws? You're supposed to be wholly devoted in the covenant relationship of marriage. It's one man, one woman for life, nobody else. You give each other your whole heart, your whole life, your whole service. It's not how much can I cheat on that without cheating, which is how some people try to start to define it. How much of a relationship can I have with somebody who's not my spouse and still not be guilty of violating that? Or, what can I do? It's okay to look as long as I don't touch, right? It's okay to touch as long as I don't touch in the wrong places. It's okay, how are we going to define that? That's where people go. And what becomes adultery? Jesus says if it's in your heart, that's the problem. Bryce?
I think what he's saying kind of behind that too is a lot like what you're saying, is in the heart. But I think when he talks about like what a cord in Christ has to fall out, right? Where basically there's not enough room in our heart for both pleasing God, doing good, and doing evil at the same time. We're either thinking about one or the other. We can't really think about both at the same time, right? Because they're so counter to each other. We can't be thinking, oh, I'm trying to please God and be lusting after someone else at the exact same time, right? So if we're constantly
point. I do think that's there. In our service to God, and again, in everything that we do, I mean, we can't be half-hearted, double-hearted, double-minded, these things that we describe, again, which could be defined as hypocrisy sometimes on there. We can't be hypocritical in that. We need to be fully devoted to God. We're fully devoted to God, and we're fully devoted to these other areas of our lives too. David?
I think he's trying to make us look more closely at ourselves by saying things. We don't need to be looking at other people.
No.
But we need to be taking care of our own soul. And
Right.
I think a lot of that is where this is going is, hey, you better, because, I mean, your thought process, is no better than, if you're doing that, you're no better than what's actually doing it.
Yeah.
But if you look at yourself.
It is.
Look at other people.
Nobody, and when Jesus is pulling these things into the heart, nobody else knows that but you anyway. I mean, we have to look at ourselves. I have to look at if I'm angry with my brother. I have to look at whether I'm lusting after other people. What's going on in my heart here, as he describes it. And even when he goes on, if your right eye is causing you to sin, tear it out. If your right hand is causing you to sin, cut it off. Again, how literally do we take that? Well, I don't think we need to take it literally, because I don't think that's really, but what is he describing there? What if somebody says, I can't help it? I just can't help it. You better help it somehow.
Well, the problem is, it's like, you're right. If you're saying you can't help it, if you're saying I can do something about it, someone will report it. So if someone says I can't do something, someone says I can, they're both wrong.
Yeah.
You've got to change your thought process to get on the right.
And I think that's what Jesus is saying there. If somebody says, look, I just can't help it. When I see a beautiful woman, I lust. Well, then you better not see beautiful women anymore. If you got to pluck your eyes out to make that not happen, then pluck your eyes out to make that not happen. If you just say, I can't help it. When I go to the grocery store and I see the person that's there, then don't go to the grocery store anymore. Make whatever change you got to make to have that happen. That's right. Bryce?
There's a book I read called Finally Free that has to do with pornography and
Uh-huh.
that kind of thing. And that's one of the things it talks about of you can't necessarily really just cure yourself of the sin itself, because if you're just fighting your outward actions, you just can't do it, because you're always going to have the time, the desire. I think there's one other thing he said, I can't remember what it is right now. But you have to cure yourself of the desire to even want to do it. If you no longer want to do it, you won't do it. It's as simple as that. I mean, yes, maybe sometimes you still slip up where you fall back into that desire and do it. But if you can start curbing and getting rid of your desire to do that thing, that's what's actually going to get it. So I think Jesus is pointing us inward towards our heart and saying, change your heart, change your mind, what you're thinking, what you want to do, and that will change your actions. It's kind of giving a progression of, it starts here, it starts in your mind, it starts in your heart, of what you want to do, what you're thinking about. So really what you want to do, then what you're thinking about, then what you do, right? And so it goes all the way through there. And so he's saying, change what you want to do, which will change what you think about, and that will change what you do.
Good point. Josiah?
There's an element of discipline here that we have to train ourselves. Whether it be adultery, whether it be the false vows, all these things, there's an element where we have to discipline ourselves to make sure that we don't go that route. Ultimately, that we don't sin. That's one of the underlying things of these commandments is not just you shouldn't murder because it's taking a life, it's a sin. To be like me, like God, you cannot do these things. You have to be righteous. In order to be righteous, we have to have an element of discipline. If we find ourselves getting undisciplined, we have to refocus. Absolutely what Bryce just said. We've got to refocus ourselves to be back in line with God.
Good point. And again, I don't know how somebody could look at the Sermon on the Mount and not see Jesus calling people to action. It's not cheap grace that he's peddling here. It's not just, oh, God loves you so much, you're just fine the way that you are, come. No, if you're breaking these commandments, you're going to be least in the kingdom. Unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, he goes through this list, and he's going to come back at the end of this section, you're to be perfect because your heavenly Father is perfect. He is calling on his disciples to do something, to be disciples, to work hard at this. Recognizing we're still not perfect, we're all flawed. I mean, that's where we always feel like we got to put that caveat in there. We're not going to earn our salvation. None of us are going to become perfect in law keeping because we're weak. I mean, we're here, but we need to do it the best that we can. We need to find a way to get stronger Yeah, and God will help us in those things. David?
Well, and one thing we need to do is stop worrying if it's on a mountain or valley, or, in other words, quit arguing if it was on a mountain or not. Stay focused on the message.
Great point. The next section, where I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, verse 31 and 32. Now it was said, whoever sends his wife away is to give her a certificate of divorce, but I say that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of sexual morality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Here again is another area where I think some people have jumped in here, they start putting more technicalities on there, just like the scribes and Pharisees did. But if you look at the essence of it, I think what Jesus is addressing, the certificate of divorce, it was written under the old law, if there was a divorce, there's a process you had to follow. You had to give a certificate of divorce. You had to do it a certain way. The law of Moses made these requirements upon you. But is that what God ever wanted? No. He doesn't want you just to divorce the right way. He doesn't want you to divorce. God hates divorce. He hates it. And so here when Jesus even comes back and says, well, it's not just giving the certificate. I say that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of sexual morality, makes her commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you might have to get into some of the technicalities to know why Jesus used that type of an expression. But the idea behind a certificate of divorce in the law of Moses gave her the right to marry somebody else. But Jesus is saying, but just because you gave her the right to marry somebody else, when she marries somebody else, if that marriage hasn't been dissolved because of unfaithfulness, now she's committing unfaithfulness even though she had the certificate of divorce. If you divorce her for a reason other than adultery, now she's committing adultery when she marries somebody else, even though you gave her the certificate of divorce. And anybody that marries her that's been put away in that way, that's been given that certificate, they're committing adultery this way. We're promoting adultery. We're promoting divorce and remarriage, and that's not what God wants. Now again, it doesn't have bearing on other areas where God allows for divorce in certain cases. This Sermon on the Mount, he's getting to the heart of the matter. It's not how can I divorce my wife? What's the right way to divorce my wife? What should our attitude be going into marriage? Are you going to get divorced? Our attitude should certainly be no, or not. That's right. That's the approach. The whole marriage, divorce, remarriage issue, most of that would take care of itself within one generation. If everybody getting married just said, we're going to get married to each other, we're going to be faithful to each other, I don't have to worry about under what circumstances can I get divorced and get remarried. Now, I know the world's an imperfect place. Not everybody does what they're supposed to do, and then you end up in these situations. But when we're looking at ourselves, I think here Jesus is removing that. It's not get divorced in the right way, it's don't get divorced. And he'll talk about that in other circumstances. David?
I believe if, the separation or whatever, they have this issue, of course, but I've always looked at it, it's almost like giving a way out because one dies, then aren't they kind of, then they can get remarried.
Sure.
If the other one dies. And so I've always thought that it interesting that if he's really trying hard to help you.
Right. Again, I would argue, like with other things that God has done, the restrictions that are placed on marriage, and it's supposed to be for life, and is that to make life harder for us or make life better for us? Make it better for us. He is not trying to make it harder. Just like the Sabbath was not designed to make life harder. It was designed to make it better. This commitment so that we're not fickle, that just every time our spouse makes us angry, every time they do something that we disagree with, we're getting divorced and getting remarried, and that kind of life is hard. You want to see how hard that is, look again out in our culture and see the people that are doing that, when they're in their 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th marriage, when they have no confidence that their marriage is going to last more than 2 days, because there's no binding covenant there. That is for our benefit. So appreciate those comments very much. Still have the false vows, the eye for an eye, and the love your neighbor left in this section before we get to the next section. But I think, again, what we find is Jesus is really drawing home kind of the heart of this matter. Any other final comments this morning before we dismiss class? Lord willing, on Wednesday night, I'm supposed to be preaching up in Gainesville that night for their summer series. So Chuck is going to go ahead and teach the class out here in the auditorium, and he'll answer all the questions that I didn't answer today and take care of the next section. So appreciate that.